A fisherman looks you dead in the eye, points toward a bend in a black river, and tells you that if you paddle past that bend after dark, you will not paddle back. He is not smiling. He is not performing for a camera. He has spent his entire life on this water. He knows exactly what a crocodile sounds like, exactly what a hippo sounds like, exactly what the wind does to the reeds at night, and he is telling you that something else lives out there. Something with no name in any zoology textbook on Earth. That is where this story starts, and by the end of it, you may find yourself unable to shake the same feeling that has followed explorers, missionaries, and scientists into the swamps of Central Africa for more than 200 years. Deep in the Republic of the Congo, straddling the border with Cameroon, lies a wetland so enormous and so waterlogged that entire sections of it have never been mapped in any real detail. It is called the Likwala Swamp, tens of thousands of square miles of flooded forest, slow black rivers, and floating islands of vegetation thick enough to walk on and treacherous enough to swallow you whole if you misjudge a single step. The water here does not look like water anywhere else. Stained by decaying plant matter, it runs the color of strong tea, sometimes so dark that a fish an arm's length beneath the surface simply disappears from view. Above it, the canopy locks together so tightly that daylight arrives filtered and dim, and pilots flying supply routes over the region describe looking down at what appears to be a single, seamless mat of green stretching to the horizon. It is one of the last true blank spaces left on the map of this planet, and it is inside that blank space that a legend has survived, essentially unchanged, since long before anyone thought to write it down. The creature is known locally by several names, but the one that has traveled furthest beyond the swamp is Mokelmbem, a phrase from the Lingala language that roughly translates to one who stops the flow of rivers. Sit with that translation for a second, because it is not a small claim. It is not the name of a large fish, and it is certainly not the name of a crocodile, an animal these communities know intimately and fear appropriately. This is a name given to something whose sheer bulk is said to be enough to dam a channel, to force a current to hesitate around its body. In other villages, spread out across different language groups and different stretches of the same basin, other names surface, translating loosely to things like the one who eats the tops of the palms, or the beast that must never be hunted. Different words, different tongues, but ask the elders to describe the animal behind the name, and something strange starts to happen. The descriptions line up. What they describe is oddly specific for something meant to terrify. There is no fire, no scales dripping with venom, no dozen rows of teeth. Witnesses describe something almost plain by monster standards, an animal roughly the size of an elephant or larger, a heavy body that spends most of its time low in the water, a long, thick tail, 4 sturdy legs that leave rounded, deeply pressed tracks in the riverbank mud, and most strikingly, a long neck rising to a small, almost delicate head. Its skin is described as smooth and grayish-brown, the color of the river itself. And here is the detail that keeps coming up, volunteered almost as an afterthought by people who have no reason to embellish: this animal does not hunt. It does not eat fish, and it does not eat people. It is said to be a plant eater, browsing on a particular vine and a certain riverside fruit, and in some tellings, villagers can walk a visitor straight to the stripped stems as proof. It only turns violent, the stories go, when a canoe crosses into water it considers its territory, at which point it does not devour, it simply overturns, and whoever is thrown into that black water rarely comes back up. Before dismissing this as a simple campfire tale, it is worth noting how far back the written record actually goes. In the late 1700s, a French missionary traveling through the same general region logged an observation, almost in passing: enormous tracks pressed into a muddy bank, spaced far wider apart than anything he recognized, left by an animal the local population knew well and clearly feared. He wrote about it the way someone jots down the weather, not as a sales pitch, not as a thriller. 2 centuries later, in the same swamp, people who had never encountered that old missionary's writing were still describing the exact same animal, right down to the shape of its neck and the width of its tracks. That kind of continuity, holding steady across generations with no written record circulating among the villagers themselves, is the detail that has pulled serious researchers into one of the most physically punishing environments on the planet. The first wave of rigorous scientific interest arrived through a herpetologist, a scientist whose entire career had been spent on the disciplined, unglamorous study of reptiles and amphibians. This was not someone chasing headlines. If anything, his professional habit was the opposite: distrust single accounts, demand corroboration, assume the mundane explanation until it is exhausted. When a researcher built on decades of skepticism starts organizing expeditions into one of the most inaccessible wetlands on Earth, it says something about what he found compelling enough to override that instinct. What convinced him was not a photograph and not a bone. It was the pattern of the testimony itself. He and his colleagues carried out something close to a controlled experiment inside a place that resists anything resembling a controlled experiment. They traveled to villages separated by days of difficult river travel, communities that spoke different languages, and had little to no contact with one another. Rather than showing a single image of the creature they were investigating, which would have obviously led the witnesses toward an answer, they assembled an entire deck of illustrations: elephants, gorillas, crocodiles, hippos, rhinoceroses, even animals that do not exist at all, shuffled together so no one could guess which picture the visitors wanted them to choose. And in village after village, when the deck reached a long-necked, heavy-bodied animal with a small head, the reaction was recognition rather than performance. People did not simply nod along. They corrected the illustration. The neck is longer than that, one would say. The tail bends differently, another would insist. The skin should be darker, more like the river. Independent communities, cut off from one another by geography and language, were not just picking the same card, they were making the same specific corrections to it. A shared myth can drift and mutate, as it spreads from village to village and generation to generation, the way a story told around 100 different fires naturally changes shape. What these expeditions documented instead was something that held its shape across isolation, which is closer to what happens when independent people are describing an animal they have genuinely encountered rather than repeating a story they were told. It's worth pausing on why nobody has simply walked out of that swamp with a body, a skeleton, or an undeniable photograph, because that absence is exactly what skeptics point to first. The Licuala Basin is not an easy place to search. It is larger than some entire countries, mostly inaccessible by road, and much of it is not solid ground at all, but a floating mat of vegetation resting over water so dark it swallows light within inches of the surface. There are stretches inside it that no outsider is confirmed to have ever entered. From the air, the canopy is so uniform that a helicopter would need to be directly above an animal in a rare clearing at the precise right moment to see anything at all. In water that dark, something the size of an elephant could surface within feet of a canoe and vanish again, before anyone's eyes adjusted. This is not a wide-open lake where a strange shape would eventually be caught on someone's camera. This is an environment that seems almost engineered to keep its secrets, and the local legends account for that too. One story recurs again and again in the testimony, offered by elders as the reason certain stretches of river are treated as forbidden. Generations back, so the account goes, a group of hunters finally cornered the animal in a narrowing channel and killed it, tired of losing fishing grounds to a creature they could never see clearly. In the custom of the time, they cooked and ate its flesh. Every person who ate it died. Whether that story is read as literal history, or as a warning dressed up in metaphor, almost doesn't matter, because of what it explains either way: why no one has ever produced a body. It is not that a body cannot be found. It is that within the logic of these communities, you do not touch this animal, you do not eat it, and you do not go looking for it. A culture that has wrapped an animal in that kind of taboo is, by definition, a culture that will never hand a skeptic the proof they are demanding. And the reports never really stopped. Through the 20th century and into this one, thin but persistent accounts kept surfacing from people with little obvious motive to invent them. A missionary who spent years living along these rivers described being told, without prompting, by several unconnected men in separate locations, about an animal that surfaces near dusk. A survey crew mapping timber recorded a local guide who flatly refused to paddle past a particular bend in the river and would not explain why until well after sunrise. There are second-hand reports of a low, resonant sound rolling across the water at night, a sound that does not match anything in the extensive catalogue of noises these communities can already identify, and their lives genuinely depend on being able to identify almost everything that makes noise in that swamp. When people whose survival hinges on knowing every grunt, splash, and call in their environment say a particular sound belongs to nothing they recognize, that carries a different kind of weight than an unfamiliar noise reported by a tourist. So it becomes necessary to do the less exciting work, ruling out the ordinary explanations one at a time, because if even one of them accounts for everything in this file, the mystery collapses. The first candidate is the most obvious. Central Africa has historically been home to both black and northern white rhinoceroses, and a rhinoceros half-submerged, head low, horn breaking the surface at an odd angle, could plausibly rattle an unprepared traveler. But this explanation falls apart on the testimony of the very people who would know the difference best. These communities have separate, well-established names for the rhinoceros, and when shown mixed decks of illustrations, they passed over it without hesitation while consistently returning to the long-necked shape. The rhinoceros does not survive contact with the eyewitnesses. The second, stronger candidate is the crocodile. Nile crocodiles reach lengths that genuinely stagger the imagination, and a large old individual glimpsed end-on in poor light could read as something far larger and stranger than it is. But the crocodile is exactly the animal these villagers know best, the one responsible for real, painful losses within living memory. They describe it with the specific, hard-won familiarity of people who have buried someone because of it. And crucially, they describe the other creature as something the crocodile itself avoids, occupying deep pools that crocodiles are said to steer clear of. A crocodile does not have a long neck. It does not browse vegetation along a riverbank. The posture, the diet, and the proportions in every account simply do not match. The crocodile explains a fright in poor light. It does not explain the shape people keep drawing. The third explanation is not an animal at all, but the human mind's tendency to see what it has been primed to expect. This deserves real respect, because it is often the correct answer to stories like this one. A floating log, a mat of drifting vegetation, an elephant swimming with only its trunk above the surface, any of these filtered through a lifetime of hearing the same legend could plausibly become a monster in someone's memory. If this story rested entirely on frightened villagers who grew up hearing the name since childhood, this explanation might be enough to close the file. But it struggles to account for the witnesses, who were not primed at all. A foreign missionary, who had never heard the legend recording the same tracks, trained researchers, who arrived specifically intending to debunk the story and left more unsettled than when they started, and the consistency that holds even across communities, whose local folklore uses entirely different words and emphasizes different details. Misperception tends to scatter. It produces 100 different monsters from 100 different frightened minds. It does not typically produce the same long neck, the same heavy body, and the same browsing habit drawn independently by people who have never spoken to one another. What is left, once the tidy explanations have each failed on their own specific grounds, is not a confirmed animal. It is an open case. The rhinoceros fails on identification. The crocodile fails on anatomy. Misperception fails on convergence. What remains standing is the possibility of an unknown, large, aquatic animal occupying a swamp so vast and so hostile that it could plausibly avoid detection indefinitely, protected as much by taboo as by geography. But an unknown possibility is not the same thing as a proven one, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. There is no surviving photograph that holds up to scrutiny. There is no bone sitting in a museum drawer. There is testimony, consistent and difficult to dismiss, gathered from a place that seems built to withhold exactly the kind of evidence a skeptic would need to be convinced. That is not a satisfying place to leave a story, but it is the honest one. What keeps this case alive is that the swamp itself is not staying sealed off. Logging roads are pushing further into the basin every year. Shifting rainfall and changing water levels across Central Africa's river systems are altering the very channels these stories are set in, drying some out and swelling others, which means anything living in those deep pools will eventually be forced to move somewhere new. More people are reaching parts of that basin that outsiders have never set foot in before, which means the next witness might not be a river guide passing down an old family story. It might be a survey team, a research drone, or a camera left running on a bank that has never had a human footprint on it. This is not a legend quietly fading into the past. It is a question that keeps drifting closer to the present, waiting for the next person willing to go looking.